Good evening. This is Mae Brussell. It's KAZU FM in Pacific Grove, California.
The views expressed by Mae Brussell during
It's time for the disclaimer, but that machine isn't working, so we'll go without it, and I'll put on my own disclaimer. It's working, but maybe I'm not doing it right. The program, that material I give out, I'm totally responsible for the information. The station is not responsible for the information I have on the broadcast. If you want a bibliography of this material, of the subjects that I cover, you can write to me at Box 22511, Carmel 93922, and send a self-addressed stamped envelope, and I'll give you a list of the titles of the articles and the bibliography of the program. I do that each week. If you want that, I get a lot of mail. If I don't answer it right away, forgive me. But if you want to look up the articles and the information, you can do that. Now, I'm going to run down a few articles for the first half hour that are of primary importance. Each one of them would take an entire program if I did it correctly and analyzed it for you, but there's so much material in the news that unfortunately I have to race through some of this material. I'll get back to it in detail later, but if you look it up in your newspapers and library, which many of you do, I want to share it with you now so that you have it. One article came out of the Sunday London Times, December the 5th, 1982, titled, "Dealers Tout Arms in Floating Bazaars." And this is about international arms dealers. A person from America, his name is Garth Reynolds. He rents a suite in London, and he does business out of a company with the name Embassy International. And he's directly linked to that group in the Banco Ambrosiano in Milan, the Syrian drug dealer, the heroin, the cocaine, the arms dealer, and the drug dealer. They were arrested with $690 million of heroin several weeks ago, and there hasn't been a word about that in the newspapers since the arrest, even though the links of it to Banco Ambrosiano, to Roberto, Calvi, and the Vatican were there right from the beginning. The news is very silent about this particular arrest in Italy. Well, the London Times has linked the offices in London, Embassy International, to the telex machine and to the catalog of the Syrian arms dealer. His name is Henri Arsan, Henra-Arsan, and the London Times said, this is the Sunday London Times. I have another one from the Observer I want to share with you, too. Arsan was arrested 2 weeks ago in his home in northern Italy, in Varese, on illegal arms trades. They'd been investigating for 2 years. The arms were stored aboard ships in Genoa. And this is the story of buying equipment, incendiary rockets, personnel missiles, 60,000 mortar bombs, United States weapons, 25 Cobra helicopter gunships made by Bell in the United States when Edwin Wilson was selling arms to Gaddafi, and when Kevin McCullough came to Washington to break the story to the CIA 5 years ago, he complained about Bell helicopter and the Cobra helicopter gunships that Gaddafi wanted. Well, these weapons were indeed being transferred, and there were German weapons and a surplus of many thousands of Russian weapons so that they could blame the Russians. This is done out of Italy and out of Germany and out of London, and American persons. This party that is mentioned in the newspaper, Garth Reynolds, was in Los Angeles, held by the authorities briefly in 1980. Then he was released, and as I say, is directly linked to the 71-year-old Syrian arms dealer with the Italian wife. They have ships out of Genoa, and they go into ports in Italy, into Libya, Yugoslavia, and Bulgaria. Now, the London Times talks about their activities into Bulgaria. Roberto Calvi was murdered by, his wife has said, also in the London Times, by the Italian Vatican, the Opus Dei, the lay group behind the Pope. This Agca has been charged. He is claiming that he works with Bulgarians, but trying to blame the Soviet Union and the KGB for the shooting of the Pope. Yet the people that he operated with out of Germany and England in the international group out of Bulgaria are in fact linked to Banco Ambrosiano, the same group that had Roberto Calvi, the president of the bank, murdered in London. And his offices are in London. So their ships operate in Italy, Libya, Yugoslavia, and Bulgaria. They sell weapons to the Gulf War, which they promote. They sell weapons to South Africa, and they also supply the IRA. When Israel had the war with Lebanon, there was a surplus of weapons. They're peddling those weapons, and they use floating ships. And they leave Italian ports, and one of the main offices, as I say, is in Genoa. The arms were similarly stored, according to London Times, in ships in Genoa, and the helicopters and the rockets Mr. Arsene had, and these Leopard tanks, German-built Leopard tanks, thousands of Soviet-made rifles, a total package worth 138 million pounds, so you can double that. The Assange files in Banco Ambrosiano in Italy were identical to those aboard the ships that this American used from London. Now, they have safe warehouses at airports. They have harbors full of weapons. They use tramp steamers. They are floating arsenals. And the important part about this article from the London Times, and I haven't seen it in any of my American newspapers or wire services, is that they also work closely in Bulgaria and Eastern Europe, although the money and the expertise of the weapons came from Germany and the United States, and of course Russian weapons that they can leave around to say that a Russian from Bulgaria, for example, would shoot the Pope. Yet these people have Russian weapons, they have locations in Bulgaria, and this operation was exposed several weeks ago, but not in other papers that I know of except the London Times. Now, this last weekend, there was an article, the Associated Press, San Francisco Chronicle, Andropov role in Pope shooting traced. And again, the Western countries, the United States, they're trying to say that the shooting attempt on the Pope was done by the KGB. Now, the gentleman who's giving out this information is Richard Pipes. He's been at the National Security Council ever since Reagan became president. He was the gentleman who scared Europe as soon as Reagan was inaugurated by saying the Soviet Union had two choices, either to change its ways or go to war, World War III. And our allies were afraid of us for the purposes of Richard Pipes' speech as much as anything that happened as soon as Ronald Reagan was inaugurated. Now, he can't speak up and have press conferences, or so he says, if he's working for the National Security Council, but he was interviewed yesterday on CNN News. He's returning to the faculty of Harvard, so he can keep saying, as a faculty member from Harvard, that the KGB gave the green light to shoot the Pope. Well, in Europe, there's another story coming that links the banks, the telex machines, the weapons, the cities, and the Banco Ambrosiano to an operation in Italy and in London and in Germany, which is more where Agca met and worked than with the KGB. He was always part of the Nazi werewolves and the extreme right. And so Mr. Pipes was on TV yesterday, and I took a tape recorder to record what he was saying, because the name Richard Pipes sounds very American, but he sounded like a foreigner, like Henry Kissinger, and I never thought of him as possibly being a German who changed his name, so we must do some research and see where he came from, or if he's like Colonel Willoughby, the English title of the German advisor, chief of American intelligence with General MacArthur during the entire war in the Pacific. We'll have to do more checking out of Richard Pipes. The Soviet Union had an article in the paper this morning, Pope death plot, denial by Russia. The Soviet Union said the United States is fomenting this to cover up its own complicity in violence at home and in allied countries. Well, the similarity could be made when Lee Harvey Oswald worked for Navy intelligence and worked for the Soviet division of the National Security Council with people like Mr. Paisley and the whole group that later were to be tied directly to the Nuganan Bank in Australia. When Lee Harvey Oswald worked in the Navy intelligence in the Soviet Union, he was brought home and brought a wife, a Tsarist Russian, a white Russian, but then she was made to look as if they were communist sympathizers, which they never were, and he applied for a passport to Cuba. And the whole role of Lee Harvey Oswald making a record in New Orleans saying he was a Marxist, or applying for a passport in Cuba, or somebody using his name, it wasn't him, at the Cuban embassy in Mexico. The photographs of the man there are not Lee Harvey Oswald at all that the CIA took. This purpose of giving him this cover of saying he was a Marxist, saying he liked Fidel Castro, handing out a few pamphlets, was to make it appear that the communists killed John Kennedy. And the same thing is being used in Europe and in the United States to say the Bulgarian was a communist. Well, out of London, in the London Times, and I'm sure other European newspapers, Bulgaria and the CIA and Bell helicopters and the London arms merchants and the ports that they use, and the Vatican Bank, Ambrosiano in Milan, are all being exposed over in Europe. Now, the London Times, that same issue, had an article by Roberto Calvi's widow. I had on the air some comments that his son mentioned. His son lives in Washington. She is directly accusing the Vatican of having her husband murdered. She said she believes that her husband, Roberto Calvi, was trying to make a deal with the right-wing faction within the Vatican connected to Opus Dei, and I've done many broadcasts on this group. These are the lay people that wanted to assume the debts of the Vatican, $1.4 billion, and in return control the Vatican. They controlled Spain under Franco and contributed to Hitler's rise and Mussolini's rise, and now they want to take control, seize control of the Vatican. She said the Vatican, those in the Vatican who are against the Opus Dei did not want this to take place because it would have allowed Opus Dei to seize their power. Opus Dei is a worldwide organization, a lay Roman Catholic organization that is singled out for special favor by the Pope recently. And Mrs. Calvi said that this group, this Opus Dei faction in the Vatican, had repeatedly warned her husband against trying he wanted to make a deal with them, and her husband was getting death threats, and people were warning him in the Vatican, don't make any deals with the Opus Dei. And she said her husband was very frightened. He had 11 bodyguards, but they weren't with him when he died. She alleges that the family was warned previously there were threats against their life in their country home in Milan by gangs of priests, and after these warnings, they were provided with protection by the orders of General Delle, Chiesa, Chiesa, who then himself was murdered. And he was trying to protect Roberto Calvi. And he got tangled with what she calls the money changers in the Vatican. And then she said her husband had reason to expect the Paul Marcinkus, that's the controversial Chicago-born treasurer of the Vatican Bank. He thought Marcinkus would help him. She said apart from being business associates, the Archbishop Marcinkus frequently visited the Calvis in the Bahamas. Marcinkus was happy when they came to Nassau. He kissed me on the cheek, and they were happy. But she said once Roberto was dead, Marcinkus didn't help in any possible way. And she says she's pleading as a Catholic to get these people out of the Vatican and help get this thing straight, not only for justice, but to get these sources of pain and the people that are killing outside of the Vatican. And she says that Marcinkus has turned against her, that her husband had to be murdered, otherwise the Vatican would have been completely exposed, and her good friends turned against her. There was a brief news item. I have it in a pile of articles at home, the date. It came out very quickly, either CNN News or one of the evening news programs, not the major CBS or NBC, like the 5 to 5:30 news. It had to do with Jean Peters, the actress, who got an application to get some of the Howard Hughes money or estate, being Howard Hughes' wife. And they said on the television, it was this past week, and I jotted the date and the announcer down, and I'll find it for you by next week, I hope. But this week they said that Jean Peters, the actress, was never married to Howard Hughes, and she was never, in fact, divorced from Howard Hughes. And those were 2 points that Terry Moore was putting in her book and that I had researched extensively, that the actress was used for the excuse that Howard Hughes was alive when he wasn't. She claims that being at the church service up in Nevada, Nevada, little town up there was no priest, there was no service. She got a $26 million settlement from the Summa Corporation or the Mormon Mafia around Howard Hughes just for going through this act. And she says it was never consummated. You can't consummate it with a ghost unless it be Vance Cooper, who's buried in Howard Hughes' grave. So this fictitious wedding took place at the time that Howard was actually buried and no longer visible in 1971. And when the Hughes so-called Hughes body was cashed in 1976. That was Vance Cooper. Then she divorced Hughes and got a $26 million settlement for this entire charade. The Howard Hughes story is a story that really should be told again. I've done many items on it in years past on the radio. A fascinating story, but now for the first time on the national television, they said this week that marriage never was consummated. She never thought it was a marriage. It was the rehearsal for the scene of a movie. That's a pretty good rehearsal, $26 million. The Lewises, James W. Lewis and his wife Leanne, have been arrested. I did 3 or 4 tapes on the Tylenol story. They are very important because they had a tax service in Kansas. They had murdered a man and gotten off the charges, even though the evidence was so overwhelming. It was a question of how the evidence was gotten. But this friend of theirs was murdered, this elderly gentleman, and they got off that. They have import-export business. And one turned herself in, she turned herself in, and he was arrested in the library in New York. And the Monterey Herald had a story, Tylenol case surprises promised. Well, that's what Kevin McCullough promised, but he never lived long enough to give those surprises. But the point is that they are in custody now, and the one clue to their role is the travel agency that she worked for in Chicago. This was, I'm sure, a dummy front. She had to give a fictitious Social Security, but they had lots and lots of aliases, the two of them, and she was charged with that. But the name of the stockbroker is concealed from the national media. A very wealthy Chicago person, one of the wealthiest, well-known people in Chicago, a stockbroker, was where his wife worked in Chicago. The agency was closed. The way they picked up the person at all was that their $1 million extortion note was supposed to go through that Continental Illinois Bank in Chicago, through this person's account, the travel agency account, that's the well-known stockbroker, down to the Cayman Islands. And there was some flaw in this transaction, or they would be home free with the money. But what their import-export business is that goes to India, or whether it's linked, I believe it's linked to the IG Farben connections easily. It could be linked to the Bayer aspirin competitors. And who in the heck this person is in Chicago that's been concealed this long, I hope that in some way they'll bring this out. What she'll probably do is plead guilty to falsifying a Social Security card and get off free. We won't hear much about that case, I'm sure. Now, another important article, one of the most important that I've seen in terms of my research, came from the London Observer. Tom Davis up at Capitola sent it to me. It's called Scandals Put Lucky Country, which is Australia, in a Bad Way. This is by Michael Davey. Now, this article goes into the financial problems going on in Australia, and you can superimpose many other countries, including the United States, in this story. But this is the first story outside of my particular radio programs that attempts to make a connection by this writer of evidence coming in now that eventually people have to face. And they're telling about Australia having troubles with the minerals not selling, the manufacturing's eroded, unemployment is high, racism is spreading, there's drought. No one can remember such grim circumstances. But something is happening, he writes. The difference, he'd been away a year, the difference lies in the glowing proof that Australia is an alarmingly corrupt society. Now you can take Germany, Italy, England, the United States, Australia, wherever the NATO countries, wherever the American Galen CIA operations are going since World War II. Certainly maybe corrupt before, but not as bad, but it's snowballing now, it's coming apart. And as I said just before the New Year's and Christmas, I won't talk about the banks on the verge of collapse, but this article goes into a point that he's telling about when he lived in Australia before, went away for 1 year and came back. He says, in this country, now he recognizes what has happened since 1981 to 1982 is that all the stories and scandals that he heard have turned out to be much bigger than anyone at the time realized. By 1982, people are getting smarter. It took from 1981 to 1982. He says they are bigger than anyone realized, and they all link up. The murders, the suicides, the disappearance of the Royal Commission witnesses, think of these witnesses that I account for here on this program that have been killed. The massing, shredding of documents like Richard Nixon's Watergate and the Gemstone Papers and the massive shredders that come in when somebody's arrested. The shadow of the CIA, the expanding heroin trade, that was right out of the Nugan hand, and the CIA, and the financial scandals. And I've been talking about the bank robberies, the missing millions, the missing billions, the debts run into the heroin trade, the gun runners that are crushing these individual countries. And it tells about a New Zealand couple who were found dead on Victoria Beach, and it emerged they were ex-couriers for a drug ring, the so-called Mr. Asia Syndicate. Its boss, Terence John Clark, was later jailed for life in England under the name of Alexander James Sinclair for the murder of his agent, chief of operation. And after Clark and a henchman were shot, they shot Mr. Asia on the M1. They cut off his hands and head and put him in the boot of a car and threw it over a quarry. Then the Nugan Hand Bank in South Wales in January 80, Frank Nugan, his brains were blown out. He was in his Mercedes-Benz. Soon afterwards, Michael Hand disappeared. The bank had offices in Manila, Thailand, Hong Kong, Saudi Arabia. The names of ex-CIA heavies keep cropping up in connection with his remarkable bank, thanks to energetic reporters. Next, there was the Painters and Dockers Union in Melbourne, so notorious, he said it makes the Teamsters in America look like a sewing circle, and members of the union would be murdered. Then there was a tax avoidance, growing cause for concern, and we have this with our offshore banking and taxes since 1977, and it goes into the emerging picture of the changing of government, the appointment by Mr. Fraser, the Prime Minister, to investigate inquire into the Painters and Dockers. And this article goes into what has happened with these major scandals in Australia. And it goes into the drugs, the murders, the convicted criminals, the suicides, the banking scandals, the missing money, the profitable business of gun running and heroin gave rise to a cash flow. The cash finances drug deals, international arms deals, such as that one in Italy in the Banco Ambrosiana in Milan. The laundering of money, and as did Mr. Asia's syndicate. And then it goes from New South Wales to the United States, where they're looking into the Nugan Hand. This is retired U.S. military, our top United States military, and CIA, and the Nugan Hand Intelligence Organization, including the CIA. New evidence about the Nugan Hand indicates it was millions of dollars into drug deals, sale of arms into Rhodesia, and with Michael Hand and the bank manager, that's Bernie Houghton in Saudi Arabia. And this article goes into siphoning off money. The doctors are ripping off the National Health Service to the tune of $100 million to $160 million a year. The New Zealand couple that were murdered had started talking in secret to the Federal Narcotics Bureau. This is a story of missing millions, of drug traffic, of murders of witnesses, of shredding of evidence, of the Central Intelligence Agency that went completely bananas with gun running, drugs, and has spread this disease. It is a disease at many levels of bankrupting countries and putting people into, such as labor unions and doctors and professional people involved. The important thing about this is that this person writing for the London Observer, as I said before, said that what were individual stories and scandals turned out to be bigger than anyone at the time realized, and they all link together. That's why it's important to listen to these broadcasts every single Monday and not miss a Monday, because everything that I talk about links to the weeks or the years before. Otherwise, I wouldn't be talking about it. It would be new information that links to back to the old period, and particularly the time as soon as World War II is over, that period from 1943 to 45, and then the John Kennedy assassination, and the teams that were locked in at one time period and locked in again, who are doing those things to our country that are happening in Australia, and he links that to our country. Last week I mentioned Rosemary Clooney and the TV show, and her mentioning being in the Ambassador Hotel when Robert Kennedy was murdered. The reference to that, in case you want it, is the Washington Post, page C10, December the 8th, 1982. It's a description of the movie on TV of her life, and it tells how she went on the skids after witnessing the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy. That allegedly triggered her breakdown, But the review of the TV movie said the screenplay never makes a serious attempt at discerning the roots of her misery. Why did she break down there? Now, speaking of deaths of witnesses, which he calls attention to in this article, and it's so important because it's happening all the time. Colin Chapman, 54, died in London, also in London where Roberto Calvi was murdered. He died in London this last week. This is the New York Times, December the 17th, 1982. Colin Chapman died of an apparent heart attack. You know, there's these apparent suicides and apparent heart attacks. There's so many of them. He was involved in the development of the DeLorean sports car, and he was the designer and builder of the Grand Prix racing cars. He was involved with Lotus Cars Limited, which was near bankruptcy. That was the DeLorean car, but which was linking up to the Toyota, which is a new switch to the Toyota Corporation. A Rolls-Royce spokesman, Reg Abiss, A-B-I-S-S, said there was a 3-year agreement for distribution of Lotus sports car in London. It came to an end, and the Lotus was making efforts to meet with Toyota. The company's 1981 accounts, released after a long delay, they held those up until Mr. Colin Chapman was murdered, disclosed that the Lotus had been paid for their engineering work by the ill-fated attempt of John DeLorean to build a car in Ireland. But the funds were paid from that Swiss-based Panamanian company run by a DeLorean distributor. Now, the Lotus car, the designer came out of Italy, and they worked in London, and there was that mysterious bank account of approximately 17 million that DeLorean had with a dummy front that hasn't been identified in Panama. So Colin Chapman was involved in this Swiss-based Panamanian company run by a DeLorean distributor. Mr. Chapman denied having any interest in the Panamanian company, but he had been expected to be challenged, I guess, in the courts on the DeLorean relationship at a future. The stockholders' meeting was to take place, but he had an apparent heart attack. Mr. DeLorean is awaiting trial on cocaine charges. In the United States, Mr. Chapman's cars began racing in Indianapolis in 1963. He designed these cars. He worked in the Royal Air Force. He joined the British Aluminum Company. He started his Lotus Engineering Company, and it was through this Lotus Company that John DeLorean had used it for a Panama, goodness knows what, just like the Vatican has not yet said and never will probably, about their $1.4 billion in Panama, 9 Panama banks, and in the Bahamas and Nassau. So this apparent heart attack took a primary witness, which is exactly, as I say, what they were explaining in Australia is happening, the murder of witnesses. And one more item on the news for this first half hour before I get into another important subject that it was in the news this week, and then going back in time slot to World War II. The Japanese experiments, some more information on the germ tests in Manchuria. The Manchurian mask is lifted. Again, this is from the Los Angeles Times. The first articles were brought out by Mr. Powell, how the Japanese gave canisters of bubonic plague, gangrene, anthrax bacteria to prisoners of war, including American soldiers during the war. The women were infected with syphilis, impregnated, gave birth, then were vivisected to assess the effect of the disease on the children. Does that remind you of what the herpes could be? They gave these diseases. Then these new studies, there's some more studies on more details, how the people who did the experiments were used by the United States, how the United States decided that we would do nothing about the atrocities for national defense, and that we would use the experiments because, according to this news account out of Fort Derrick, Maryland, the principal U.S. Bacteriological Warfare Center concluded that we couldn't do these experiments in our country, that there's too many scruples attached to American experiments. But the doctor who did the experiments continued to live comfortably in Japan and work with the United States. They had ceramic pods that carried plague, and they dropped balloons. They planned to do this on cities and give plague. And they had terrible teams. They had frostbite teams where they tied people to stakes and had them frozen and then tapped their bones to see how they sounded. I could go through some grisly experiments, and I'll do more on what they did because those people still work with the United States Army. But because it's just Christmas, we won't go into that right now. What we'll do is take a 1-minute break and say it's KAZU FM in Pacific Grove, California. So what I wanted. Side 2 tape of broadcast number 576, December the 20th, 1982. I don't take much time out for holiday news because these tapes are played, I hope, over and over and received by subscription, and when the holidays are long gone, the information will still be new and used. And so I'll just say have happy holidays, and we'll get on with the second half of this broadcast. Now, there was an article in the newspaper this morning, and it fits in with things that I've been studying and other people have been studying, and I want you to consider it carefully, and I hope maybe I can write some articles or pamphlets on this matter. I have a little bit of time if I start tomorrow. The article is called Anti-Terrorism Plan for the Los Angeles Olympics, and I have reason to believe that the same Squad 19, the LAPD force, and Evil Younger, I call him Evil Younger down there, and the team that was going to have a military coup in the United States in 1972, even the plans to kill Richard Nixon and to put Spiro Agnew as president, are operating, and that 1984 in Los Angeles could be the place where the United States changes its name and the swastikas could start flying. The newspaper story out of the LA Times says if there's major terrorism at the 1984 Olympic Games, the FBI will take the lead in handling the situation. Now, if they wanted to stop the Olympic Games terror, they would bring in Mr. Wilson and Turpel and Corcola and Carlos, and the CIA paid for the Munich Olympic Games massacre with Richard Helms and the Nixon staff that worked with the CIA and the Reinhard Gehlen operation. There's so much evidence to link the Central Intelligence Agency to the Munich massacre, and even by the admission of the people involved. And also, I wrote an article in 1974, the SLA is the CIA. And if you don't memorize that article, and it's a long book-length article, you won't know what's going to hit you in 1984 in Los Angeles. Mr. Webster just took a helicopter tour of the area to familiarize himself with the far-flung sites of the Olympics. Now, what they're going to use is the U.S. commando unit called the Delta Blue Light Team that will be poised in readiness, ready to deal with terrorists. The FBI will use the Delta Team. Now, out of Fort Bragg, North Carolina, a group, the Delta Team, the Blue Light Team, also called Charlie's Angels, was created under the command of Colonel Charles Beckwith. Now, you remember him. He was the one who had the hostage rescue, only his own men died, and they didn't rescue the hostages in April 1980. Instead of being kicked out on his ass, they get promoted and continue the same shtick. But Fort Bragg, North Carolina, is where the special forces were sent after World War II by the Nazis and the people that worked directly with Adolf Hitler's agents all the way down the line, and Fort Bragg has been the place to prepare for such an event, such as the Olympic Games, and wouldn't you know, today's paper, they're getting ready to do it. Now, that was in the San Francisco Chronicle and the LA Times, December the 20th, 1982. Another story, November 16th, 1982. 20th Century Fox Studio pays $1 million for the right to film the 84 Olympics. Won't that be great? With Gerald Ford and Anna Chenault and William Rogers and Henry Kissinger. Henry Kissinger, the protege of Fritz Kramer, who worked directly with the Nazi generals, and I'll give you some of their names, and with John J. McCloy and the Chase Manhattan and Alan Dulles, the same team of people that have been working since Hitler's Reichstag are really getting ready now. The board of directors of Marvin Davis's 20th Century Fox is a who's who of espionage, and the Olympic Organizing Committee is giving them $1 million for the right to film that event. I wonder who got the $1 million to film these Arabs on the balcony and leaving out the story of who really was behind the Munich Games. Now, Edwin Wilson's name was also in the newspaper this week, October the 20th, just this morning, as a matter of fact. Jack Anderson, how Edwin Wilson of the CIA was planning his own counterintelligence group, those special forces, such as would protect the Olympic, and he was to train in counterespionage, except his wife didn't want it at his ranch. That doesn't mean the plans didn't go on. It means his wife didn't want it. Late in the spring of 1977, Edwin Wilson had the ID for the LEAA, that was a law enforcement terrorist group under Richard Nixon and Agnew, for the Counterintelligence Counter-Terrorist Group. He was to receive $20 million on Wilson's training. He has this very expensive farm in Virginia right next door to Mr. Warner, the Senator Warner, who received his farm by marrying Richard Mellon's sister, Richard Mellon Scaife, and getting a settlement of $10 million so that Edwin Wilson, and Warner are ass backwards property right next to each other in Virginia. Wilson wanted $20 million to train these people. It was turned down because his wife didn't want it on their property. But he set up training camps and terrorist camps for Amin Turpal did, and for Gaddafi in Libya, and taught them. They had regular factories of terrorism. So it's believable that if he didn't do it and his wife didn't like it, that doesn't mean it stopped. You don't have a $20 million project just dumped and not used. Now, several weeks ago, this was 6 weeks ago, broadcast 570, I referred to a newspaper article that John Loftus had regarding two important men, SS Major Friedrich Buchard, Buchardt. He's from the Himmler's Gestapo, Mr. Buchard, who never was called before the Nuremberg trial, and another man, Brigadier General Franz Alfred Seix, who was supposed to hunt down Soviet communists if they were in the Russian territory, infiltrating the Nazis who were getting ready for World War II. Now, these Nazis, according to the headline of the story, came out of the Washington Post, mass killers assisted the CIA, helpful Nazis who evaded justice. And the important thing about these particular Nazis are that they are the ones, Mr. Seix and others, who set up the special forces, the group that became the special forces that will be taking care of those Olympic Games in Los Angeles, where the FBI is licking their chops to handle that so-called that terrorism. And goodness knows they can take the Russian weapons found in Lebanon, get them from Israel to the Los Angeles police and to these people, and have this great, the Russians taking over Los Angeles. Now, David Emery up north in Palo Alto and Sunnyvale noted and called attention to a book which I had and had not read yet. It's a new book by the same man who gave this information about the Nazi killers working for the CIA. The book is called The Belarus Secret by John Loftus. If you want to give yourself one gift for Christmas or the New Year or to a friend during the year, it's put out by Alfred Knopf, New York, 1982. John Loftus had worked for immigration for the Justice Department, trying to find these Nazis and where they were and the work that they were doing in this country. Now, in this book of The Belarus Secret, David was quick to note that Reinhard Gehlen, who was Hitler's chief of intelligence for the Eastern Division, worked very closely with Mr. Wisner, W-I-S-N-E-R, of the CIA, who by 1947 had a network going between the Nazi war criminals and the American Army. It began before then, but this Dr. Buchard, who's mentioned in both the book and in the newspaper article, was a major war criminal, and he was a partner with Dr. Franz Seix. That's the fellow that, as I mentioned several weeks ago. They commanded in Europe mobile killing units, and they were part of Hitler's special group, the Einsatz Group B, EINSATZ separate B, where most members had been waiting trial for the Nazi war crimes at the tribunal at Nuremberg. They were charged with systematically liquidating millions of Jews and Eastern Europeans as well as Jews. Buchard, in exchange for his life, gave his documents of his work. He got off, and Dr. Franz Seix, it's S-I-X, like six, was also relieved from the Nuremberg trials. Now, at the time the trial was going on, Mr. Gehlen, Hitler's chief of intelligence, suggested that they hire Dr. Seix to head and train the special forces. The special forces became the sabotage unit that formed our Green Beret for the CIA at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, that was to form them. And Gehlen wanted Dr. Franz Seix to head what he called his special forces so that he could recruit them for a future invasion of Russia, and also to set up sabotage and these various killers. And counterintelligence is to make it look like the other person did it. That's when you have a Bulgarian with a Russian weapon, and you have a Agca who works in Frankfurt and in Germany and Madrid with the Nazis since he was a youth. You can say the Bulgarians did it because you supply them with the Bulgarians' weapons. That's counterintelligence. Seeks, according to the new book by John Loftus, was at the moment on trial for his crimes at Nuremberg. Now, this was at the time that Mr. Galen wanted the OSS to get forces going to make that war against Russia the next war. He was on the docket in Nuremberg, and he was supposed to receive a 20-year prison term. And some of the commanders of one group were sentenced to death. But in 1950, this is 5 years after the war was over, High Commissioner John J. McCloy, who was chairman of Chase Manhattan Bank, the bank that hires Henry Kissinger, the protege of Fritz Kramer, and also the bank that had Allen Dulles as their attorney. High Commission and John J. McCloy also was on the Warren Commission covering the Russian part of the espionage of Lee Harvey Oswald when Leon Marino worked for Navy intelligence. John J. McCloy, 5 years after the day the war was over, released Mr. Seeks, who was supposed to be sentenced at Nuremberg, so that he could work with the Special Forces project that went on to form our Green Berets. Wiesner of the OSS that became the CIA, the head of the CIA, and Galen used their Nazis, the ones that Loftus is referring to in his book. They formed a secret army, and between when the war was over and when 1950 they got the go-ahead for really getting their special forces, they got good pay and good living conditions, and they worked with Americans and former Wehrmacht and Waffen SS instructors. Many of the recruiters, people recruited of the Belarusa, the Nazi criminals, and the SS were put on government payrolls, and the cover was that they were Polish Labor Service Battalion. They were paid by the United States CIA through Reinhard Gehlen, and they were called Polish laborers, but they were actually German Nazi SS, and they had kept their same command structure that they had as Nazis. They just changed their uniforms, according to Loftus's book, and went on the American payroll. Some had Polish army papers signed for them, and they had forged papers. Now, Loftus, in this very important book, and this is the origin of the Special Forces, and also I'll give some quotations of Reinhard Gehlen's book again, Spy of the Century, how our Special Forces were formed. These were the people at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. John Loftus, in this book, tells about the Office of Special Investigation, the OSI, out of the Justice Department, how Frank Wiesner, secretly working for the Central Intelligence Agency, began covert operations in his war against the Soviet Union in 1948. He began the Cold War espionage in 1948. His title was Director of Office of Policy Coordination. He began at that time. At the end of the World War II, he was convinced of the inevitability of a future war with Russia. Mr. Wiesner, his background is a wealthy family from Mississippi, University of Virginia Law School, and then into a Manhattan law office where he worked with the bankers who had funded, these people funded Hitler and wanted the war against the Soviet Union. At the end of World War II, he knew that war was inevitable with the USSR. You and I didn't know it. We were too dumb, but they knew it. And therefore, they recruited Nazi collaborators that worked with Hitler's Third Reich. The purpose was to use them as underground agents to overthrow communists, to spread dissension such as Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Poland today. Those are their agents. Now, Wiesner was allowed deniability to say he didn't know these people if they were caught. Propaganda, economic warfare, all the money they wanted, sabotage and subversion of the governments where these people were living, and of course probably blaming the Soviet Union. By 1948, Wiesner went to Germany. He worked then starting with the Iron Guard, even before 1950. The excuse of the Iron Guard, the Nazi Romanian war criminals being used in this country and they were brought to Whittier, to Richard Nixon's office, and goodness knows where else, but that's the most notorious case because Nixon was vice president and Allen Dulles became director of the CIA by 1952, and his brother was Secretary of the State, John Foster Dulles. Wiesner worked with the Romanian Iron Guard, the Nazi collaborators. He contacted the Nazi ministries. This is on our CIA salary. Hitler's Russian expert he went to was Gustav Hilger, Hilger, who originally planned the invasion of the USSR to get ready for the next time. He recruited Friedrich Buchard, Buchardt, who's mentioned in that news article, the story of the CIA hiring the murderers. He was the chief of emigre affairs for the SS, the commander of the mobile killing units. They recruited Professor Gerhard von Mende, M-E-N-D-E. Then he visits Reinhard Gehlen, his old buddy from the end of World War II. And Gehlen, of course, was subsidized with $200 million to be giving these people money. Now, in this book, John Loftus has something very important that goes into the issue or the investigation that I've been doing on Kramer versus Kramer. Is the American U.S. intelligence Kramer that recruited Henry Kissinger and put him with these army generals after the war, Adolf Hitler's Fritz Kramer. And in this book, he says, on May the 7th, 1945, General George Patton received a telephone call from General Omar Bradley. The Germans have surrendered. Now, Patton wanted to go east and make war right away with the Soviet Union, but they called in a Dr. Stanislaw, and this is very important, Stanislaw, S-T-A-N-I-S-L-A-W, Heinrichevich, I can't pronounce it, I'll spell it, H-R-Y-N, Heinrich, K-I-E-V, Kiev, I-C-H. He was the envoy to the United States Army, and he had a meeting with General Patton's intelligence chief. Now, Fritz Kramer was working with Patton. Hitler's Fritz Kramer, American Fritz Kramer, I think the same one, Henry Kissinger was there, and this particular person was sent as the emissary of these Nazis to General Patton, and they had arranged a meeting, and this man had the names of the Nazi hierarchy and the information of the Nazi Gestapo. And he mentioned people that were disguised as Polish prisoners of war. And I've said many, many times that there are a lot of people out there that said they were victims of Auschwitz or Treblinka or Dachau who are Nazis who took on the identity of Jews and dead Jews who are out in the world denying that Nazis exist, denying the network of the Gehlen operation. And he took these people who were disguised as Polish prisoners of war. The Nazi criminals were supposed to be arrested, but in this book he says General Patton was lax in rounding up the Nazis. He insisted that he have the best of the Waffen SS to be incorporated into his Third Army so he could lead them against the Reds. Now remember, several weeks ago I mentioned Peter Drucker, the man from Vienna and Frankfurt that brought Fritz Kramer to this country, who recruited Henry Kissinger, put Kissinger in Harvard. Well, Hitler's Fritz Kramer was in the Waffen SS, and he was working with General Patton, and in this can of worms of Nazis that set up the framework for the Pentagon, for the CIA, for the Special Intelligence Operations, that you could have a whole book of alphabet letters, but they're all for covert operation to get ready to set up groups such as the Special Forces and so forth, and to stir up trouble. They have put that $50 million, there was an article in New York Times, Vatican gave $50 million to Lech Walesa. They have put money into the Eastern European countries to the point that we are totally bankrupt, $1/3 of $1 trillion, I heard on the TV last night. Again, I say I will do the figures later. We have poured money into these countries, and the Russian intelligence, being alert, just takes the money and the weapons, and we keep pouring more, waiting for that uprising. Well, the Nazi war criminals were used, and the best of the Waffen SS were brought into General Patton. And remember, Drucker says that Fritz Kramer, the Fritz Kramer that was the benefactor of Kissinger and later Haig, he was working with this particular Drucker, was working with these men who were with General Patton. He said that the general, Fritz Kramer, worked with Patton, and that was Hitler's general, because the United States didn't have anything like a General Fritz Kramer. And for those of you who maybe it's your first tape or second tape, I'll give you the list of tapes to update the Fritz Kramer story. Now, in this book, he describes the White Russian Belarusa who flew to the West. They fled there when the war was over, and that was the planning that they did starting in 1943 to 45, that they would be on the side of the West. And Loftus writes, General Patton was sheltering large numbers of SS members, Nazi Hitler's organization, Himmler's Gestapo. Here is a point that is never made. A definition of a Nazi is a member of the Nazi Party, somebody who supports Adolf Hitler, who wears swastikas and armbands and marches Heil Hitler until May the 8th, 1945. Then he's never a Nazi again. He's always an ex-Nazi. As of May the 8th, he's an ex-Nazi. There's no such thing as a Nazi around. And there's never an SS or a member of the Gestapo, Himmler, even though they swore an oath that they'd live 1,000 years. Even though they have it in writing, they want to go 1,000 years. There's no such thing as a Gestapo member alive today, even though they have multi-millions and billions of dollars of money in Swiss banks and salted away treasures in various places and hide their swastikas. They didn't even wear them at places and have meetings. They're always neo or ex-Nazis. So the day the war was over, General Patton was sheltering, ex-Nazis the day the war was over, and he's planning the next war against the Soviet Union with the same people. And in the United States, we're bringing in those experiments on American soldiers in Japan of freezing them to death and giving women the syphilis and giving birth and dissecting them. And we're bringing those valuable things from the Pacific to Fort Dearg in Maryland, and we're bringing these people into the United States Army. This book says Patton was removed from Bavaria for his failure to cooperate with the denazification program. You can say that. He had a little car accident, but the denazification program never took place. Now, here's another point in John Loftus's book. The cover for the collaborators, the Nazi collaborators, was the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Agency. How many Christmas cards have you bought for the Children's Fund to the UN? And how many times have we heard that the UN is a spy nest for the Russians, that the Russians do all their spying at the UN? The United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Agency, according to a man in the Justice Department, was the cover for the Nazi units. And Dmitry Kazmowicz, Kasmowich, commander of one of Otto Skorzeny's special units, was in the United Nations camp, and they called in the special units. Now, Skorzeny's special units were those people in the Battle of the Bulge who wore American uniforms but were Germans. And that was the time where I think Fritz Kramer was caught with his German uniform and had to sit at Dachau for a year before he came back to be advisor to the chief of the American Army. He was caught in the double uniform of the German, so they had to put him in the chair, and from that day at Dachau, he was never photographed again. So with General Patton, you have the SS people, the Skorzeny team, you have the same people that set up the special forces working early with, as soon as the war was over, and then being released by John J. McCloy. Now, in that book, Reinhard Gehlen, Spy of the Century, I've referred to it for a long time. It came out in 1971. And for those of you who don't know that book and don't know the names, there's a description here of Mr. Wiesner setting up his counterintelligence group and how the special forces, the Office of Special Operations, was set up. In a book, page 242 of this book, it tells about bringing Mr. Seeks, that's the man that Gehlen wanted, out of the docket of Nuremberg to set up the special forces. Those are the people at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, that Otto Skorzeny had a hand with the CIA in training. Fort Bragg, North Carolina, Delta Team, and the Blue Light. The book Gehlen, Spy of the Century, tells about the links of these particular people, these Germans, the Nazis of Seeks, and Dr. Franz Alfred Seeks, and another man, a Professor Achmeteli, Achmeteli, who worked for Adolf Hitler. In 1945, Dr. A.K. Michael, he used that name, went into hiding. He lived near Dachau. He was paid a salary from the Central Intelligence Agency when it was formed, starting in 1947. He was then released, and this particular person came from a family who had oil holdings. His father was a wealthy oil man in the Soviet Union before it was the Soviet Union. Dr. Michael Achmeteli, Achmeteli is the spelling. His father had oil discovered by the British American mining engineers, including Herbert Hoover. And remember, several weeks ago, I told how Wild Bill Donovan of the OSS was up in Vladivostok with Herbert Hoover meeting the White Russian Tsarist. This was before World War II broke out. Donovan was up there with Herbert Hoover's gang, the Russians that had been deposed, trying to get those minerals and gold and oil back in the hands of the Hoover clique, the London, the United States clique that had oil and mineral in Russia. So the very person that was working with Mr. Siegs, that was working with Galen on a salary from the United States, came directly from Nazi Germany. He fled Russia at the time of the revolution and went to Germany. One of his closest friends was Dr. Alfred Rosenberg, the originator of the Nazi Aryan doctrine. So this book of Galen's Spy of the Century goes into how these men were selected for the special forces and how they were important in putting Hitler into power, how they were important in creating the genocide, the plans for genocide, how they were used after the war, how they've been on the salary of the United States government since World War II in the OSS and then the CIA. Another article out of the newspaper today, FBI radio station needs more money. They need $12 million to cover the Los Angeles system. Los Angeles will get the first full system. The FBI, we've got to have it in time for the 1984 Olympics. They said, they referred to the 1972 games in Munich where the Arab terrorists killed 17 people, including 11 Israeli athletes. So the FBI is taking a helicopter and going over Los Angeles. They've put the Special Forces group from Fort Bragg, North Carolina, in charge of terrorism in Los Angeles. They've asked, in a time of money being hard up, a contract with Motorola to begin producing a radio station immediately, first system for the 1984 Olympics. Remember when I wrote, Why Was Martha Mitchell Kidnapped? It was about the planned coup in 1972. And the radio communications with James McCord from the Pentagon Defense Department and the maps of Washington and the streets that would be cut off that were at the desk of E. Howard Hunt. It didn't happen in 1972 because of Watergate and factors in switching the money to the East Coast. They couldn't do it on time and they got caught at the Watergate Hotel. But it's 1984 the date that all this was going to take place. Now next week I'll do some more on very important man, Leon Jaworski, who died last week. I haven't had time this week to update the Leon Jaworski story, but I want to do that for you. And I also want to talk some more about Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and the assassination of John Kennedy, how it was planned by those Nazis in Fort Bragg, South Carolina, knowing that Lee Harvey Oswald would be the patsy and knowing the role of Marina and Lee Oswald in the Soviet Union at the Minsk radio factory and the Navy intelligence role that Lee had in the Soviet Union, and trying to make it appear a communist killed John Kennedy. They're trying to make it appear that the KGB ordered the murder of the Pope to kill the head of the Catholic Church, the Antichrist. Well, we've covered a lot of material. I'll be doing much, much more on the Olympic Games. We should be alerted to the Los Angeles team. They have the network, they have the expertise, they know how to do it, and it didn't come off before, but this is a treacherous thing, putting those people in charge, and they're starting their budgets for what they call security instead of cleaning up the Munich Olympic Games. Okay, our time is up. It's 1 minute. I got less than 1 minute. We'll put on the disclaimer, and then we'll turn over the station to some nice music, and you can relax. This is Mae Brussell in Pacific Grove, California.